Hey friends, it's Just the Gems, I'm Brandon. You know, I've done some reviews on this channel. That's right, the channel that I started to be primarily a JRPG review channel has, in fact, done like half a dozen reviews out of 106 videos. Well, anyway, it's fun talking about a particular game that I have strong feelings about, but when I sat down to think about how to make that process even more fun, I had a thought. Less is more. Then I thought a little harder about it and I realized that's nonsense. How can less be more? It's antithetical. And thus was born my new video series, Dueling Reviewing. Dueling Reviewing. I'm still workshopping the title. But regardless, rather than just review one game at a time, I'll review two games that are similar in some way. Maybe they come from the same team, or they have similar gameplay, or something like that. And not only will I tell you my thoughts about them, but I'll pit them against each other. So you get two reviews for the price of one, with the added drama of a needless competition. We all win! First up in the arena is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI. From one angle, these two games couldn't be more different in terms of tone, characters, scope, but at their core, these are both reimaginings of what the Final Fantasy formula both is and could be, and in a way they present two different paths the series can take going forward. So let's talk about them. How about it? Square Enix seems to have pushed turn-based combat aside for its biggest releases, either because they incorrectly think it doesn't sell well, take a look at Persona 5 if you believe that, or because they just don't want to make turn-based Final Fantasies anymore. If the latter is the case, and it's truly just their artistic intent at work, then I'm fine with it. And besides, as I've gotten older, I've started to enjoy action RPGs much more than I did as a kid. Some of it is just that I've gotten better at video games, and some more of it is games usually have difficulty levels, and I can always set it on easy if I need to, like a filthy noob. Public service announcement, that is a joke. Everyone should play games on the level of difficulty they find the most enjoyable or fulfilling. The more you know. Anyway, all that to say, both of our games today are action RPGs in the purest sense. One more than the other though. Namely Final Fantasy XVI. Clive is our hero, and we are pretty much exclusively in his shoes throughout the story. He's a deposed prince, he's got magical summoning powers, and he carries a big sword. Seems pretty standard JRPG, yeah. Combat in 16 is straight up action, and it is definitely stylish. The battle system was designed by Ryota Suzuki, who had worked on the Devil May Cry series before, so he knows a thing or two about fancy action. Now, I'm not one to get caught up in the details of a battle system. I tend to find a way to play that works for me and allows me to progress in the game, and I stick with it. I mean, chances are, if you watch my stuff on YouTube, it's not because of my insightful breakdown of gameplay systems, right? Still, gameplay is a huge part of a game, and especially in an action RPG, so I want to give it some attention. Combat in Final Fantasy XVI is pretty straightforward. You attack. You have special moves that recharge over time. The go-to strategy for beating basically anything from Behemoth to Bomb is to bash it until it staggers, and then unleash all your special moves on it in sequence. At least, that's what I did. The game never gave me a compelling reason to try playing another way. As a result, I'll admit, it made things feel pretty repetitive. Once you've gotten to know how Clive plays, and you'll be pretty squared away on that front in the first couple hours, then, I mean, that's kinda it. It doesn't change much. There, of course, are the giant icon battles, which pit little Ifrit up against enormous monstrosities controlled by other characters, and those are truly gorgeous visual showcases for the power of the PlayStation 5. But that's kinda all they are. They're not super engaging beyond how awesome they look. But there's more to a game than just how it plays, and a big part of any JRPG are the side quests. Final Fantasy XVI has a lot of them. And here's the thing, they're all sort of basically the same thing. Go and kill this guy. Go and get this thing. I mean, this has been an issue for video games for a long time. Final Fantasy XVI didn't create this problem, but it doesn't really solve it in any meaningful way. I will say that the side quests do have their own progression, and completing them all is the only way to get access to some really interesting story arcs for the secondary characters, but they murder the pacing of the main story, and they're not all that interesting on their own. Okay, that's Final Fantasy XVI's gameplay. It probably sounds like I hate it. I don't though. Honestly, I did have fun playing it, but let's talk about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Right from the beginning, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth differentiates itself from its younger sibling by giving you a bunch of characters you can control in combat. Wait, do we want to say that 16 is Rebirth's younger sibling? I mean, technically Rebirth came out more recently, but it's a remake of a super old game, and maybe I'm overthinking this? Maybe I'm overthinking this. So yes, straight away you get 5 completely unique characters with very different playstyles and abilities to control, and you can swap between 3 of them at the push of a button in mid-battle. This is probably the biggest factor in keeping the combat from being boring and repetitive. Your other party members are controlled by AI, and admittedly, they do a pretty terrible job of fighting on their own, which just encourages you to hop over to them and help them build up their ATB meters, which are bars that fill up and allow them to use special moves. So rather than only a handful of moves with their own recharge meters, here, combat actively pushes you to utilize all your characters and all their abilities as frequently as you can. This means you have dozens of spells and special abilities at your disposal all the time, and you learn a ton as you progress. And I would say that in terms of flashiness, Rebirth is easily on par with 16. These are both flashy games that are as enjoyable to watch as they are to play. It shares another similarity with 16 in that your goal in every battle is to stagger your enemy so you can kill them more easily. Where I think Rebirth wins though is the pressure system. Each enemy has its own unique way of pressuring it, which causes its stagger meter to fill up more quickly. For one, it might be hitting them with an elemental weakness. For another, it might be utilizing the terrain in a unique way to cause damage. Literally every enemy has its own way to be put into this state, and getting familiar with the enemies in the region becomes as much a part of the combat as the button mashing and spell casting. Another key difference here is that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is basically an open world game. I think the developers would consider it an open zone game. Maybe they even said that at some point, but really, it's a seamless open world. Like, I never encountered a load screen when moving from one area to another, did you? It's massive, and there are so many things to do. There are the requisite side quests, of course, but there's quite a bit more variety here than in 16. One minute you might be escorting a very good dog to make a delivery, and the next you might be racing with a dolphin and catching beach balls, and the next you might be taking pictures of constellations in a gorgeous canyon. The side quests are reasonably beefy too, but there are far fewer of them than in 16. Fewer with more substance? That seems like the way to go. But outside of the labeled side quests, there are dozens and dozens of other things to do in the various regions of the world. You can find towers like in any open world game that reveal the location of a few areas of interest. You can find life springs which give you information and lore on the region, and there are somewhat involved quests where you engage in radically different activities to uncover special relics. Speaking of those quests, let's talk about the mini games for a minute. Holy crap, there are so many different mini games. Catching Moogles, chocobo racing, card battles, robot tower defense. At around the 30-hour mark, I stopped being surprised when a new, fully fleshed out minigame was introduced. I began to expect it, and they never stopped delivering. And for the most part, I found all of them enjoyable, except the boxing minigame and the gold saucer. That one can eat my whole stupid butt. The sheer variety of gameplay on offer here means the edge has to go to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Maybe even edge isn't the right word, like the whole thing. Rebirth wins this one outright. It is so much fun, you guys. I didn't want this game to end. It was so good. If Game of Thrones met Final Fantasy and they had a whirlwind romance that led to the birth of a sweet baby video game, it would be Final Fantasy 16. It has its daddy's eyes, but that nose and mouth are all mama. If you're expecting me to say which series is the daddy and which is the mommy, you're gonna be disappointed. Anyway, 16 brought back the hardcore medieval aesthetic that everyone seems to think has always been a huge part of Final Fantasy, but honestly really hasn't. I mean, there were robots and time travel in the first one way back in the 80s. A lot of these more traditional fantasy fans were understandably very excited to explore the world of Valisthea. And I'll be honest, even though I was initially turned off by the setting, by the time the release rolled around, I was pretty pumped. Despite being a flavor of fantasy I'm not the biggest fan of, this was still Final Fantasy, and I knew it would still bring the weird it always does. And I wasn't disappointed. Graphically, this game isn't the most stunning thing I've ever seen in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Well, aside from the icon battles at least, but it does manage to convey a gritty sort of realism, emphasis on gritty. This is not a world you would want to live in, that is for sure. Most of the people are miserable peasants, and the world design really emphasizes their plight. A lot of this is the high fantasy aesthetic at work, so it's kind of par for the course, I suppose. Musically, I really enjoyed this one, but for some reason, I cannot bring to mind a single track from this game's OST. I know I liked it. I remember humming along to several pieces over the course of my 40 or so hours with it. I have a larger point to make about the music, but it'll have to wait a minute or so. Now, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The graphics here are stunning. Part of this is the development team's clear and obvious skill at work, and another part of it is just that the world of Final Fantasy VII is so much more interesting to me than Valisthea. And I say this as someone who actually really liked the world of Valisthea. The world of Final Fantasy VII, Gaia, is it? Do they officially call it Gaia? I'm just gonna call it Gaia. But Gaia just feels so real and yet fantastical at the same time. It's a sort of hyper reality. Being able to explore this huge open world that has this level of detail throughout its entirety is really an achievement. I mean, Square Enix aren't the first group of game designers to pull off an impressive open world, but one with this level of density and entertainment value is really hard to come by. And even beyond the pure visual aesthetic, the design is really killer. They really thought about what each of these places would be like and filled them with things that make them feel so lived in. Like, of course, the old mines between Kalm and Junon would have been turned into a tourist trap filled with displays and signs. Of course, Cosmo Canyon would be like Sedona in our world, full of tourists looking for spiritual enlightenment. I would never have given that a thought as a kid, but it makes total sense. Now, there are some blurry textures from time to time. I mean, fair's fair. I have to point out the negatives if I'm gonna spend this much time gushing about this game. And the music. This brings me back to my comment about the music in 16. The music in 16 was good. It was even very good, I think. But my issue with the music brings to mind something Nobuo Uematsu said recently. That's Nobuo Uematsu, famed composer of the first 10 Final Fantasies. He said in an interview recently, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically his point was that after a certain time, game composers started chasing movie scores instead of creating music that is uniquely video gamey. I felt that way for a long time, and I kind of felt like a jerk saying it, but now Uematsu said it, so kind of off the hook. And I think that's why the music in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth works so well for me. These are big, bombastic, film-like versions of songs that were specifically created as video game music. At their core, they are video game tracks. And that, to me, makes the music much more memorable, more sticky. Yeah, it's not exactly a fair comparison, because I've known these songs since I was a kid, and Final Fantasy XVI's music I only heard one time through. Still, I always notice when I hear a song in a game that sounds like an old video game song, and it always makes me feel so good. So I'm just gonna chase that feeling for as long as I can. Okay, how do we talk about story in a spoiler-free way? That's tricky, but I'll figure it out. First up, Final Fantasy XVI. I already mentioned the setting and how it was seen as a pretty big deal for longtime fans of the series that somehow forgot that Final Fantasy has never actually been all about old school medieval fantasy. Okay, that's the last bit of shade I'm gonna throw, I promise. It's all in good fun, guys. Don't slaughter me. Final Fantasy XVI is a dark, heavy, and serious story about slavery, war, and revenge. It's the first ever M-rated mainline Final Fantasy, and it leans into the more adult themes as a way of conveying the seriousness of the situation the world is in. Your main character, Clive, is a former prince, and his younger brother is the dominant of the Icon Phoenix. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the game, then those words all probably sounded familiar to you, but I promise you, you don't know what they mean. In this world, a dominant is someone who can turn into an icon. An icon is like a big summoned monster thing. Phoenix is a city in Arizona. Clive was passed over for the throne because he wasn't born with the power to turn into Phoenix, but he soon realizes he has the power to turn into something else. And that's when things go nuts. There is a ton of betrayal and wicked deeds and death all around, which again is kind of the theme they're going for here. Ultimately, Clive finds himself out in the world and on a quest to take out the almighty crystals which power magic, and to free the enslaved bearers, which are people that are born with the innate ability to do magic without the crystal's help. The story is incredibly dark. There are a few light moments here and there, and the small handful of people who occasionally fight alongside Clive, I hesitate to call them party members exactly. I mean, I guess they are, but not in any sense that most RPG fans would be familiar with. But anyway, people like Jill, Cid, and Gav are all great. In fact, there really weren't any characters I disliked. I mean, at least not in the way that the designers didn't intend. The villains are complex and layered, and that's something I'll always appreciate. Even the big baddie, who I won't spoil here, of course, but I feel like even they're represented in a fair way. All around, it's a strong story. I really enjoyed it. Now, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. where do I begin? Again, I know I put this fight together between these two games. These two games I'm a fan of, I must remind you. But I have to admit, it's not a fair fight at all. I'm such a Final Fantasy VII superfan that there's no way I can be objective. Also, this is a review, which means objectivity is literally impossible, because I am not a god and I am not therefore able to view anything through a truly objective lens. But theology aside, I need to explain some things to you about my love of the world and story of Final Fantasy VII. The setting, the characters, the story of that game triggered my imagination like no other game had before it. It was science fiction and fantasy smashed together in an almost haphazard way, but it all just worked together, as if swords and laser guns somehow made sense in the same world. The story of ex-soldier Cloud joining a terrorist group and working to bring down the massive corporation that had gotten so big it literally took over the world really got to me, and I fell in love with all the characters, except Cid. I don't think I really cared for Cid. Or Cait Sith, for that matter. Most of the characters. Okay, so there's all that. Couple that with the movie, the books, the other games, all these other lenses into the world of Final Fantasy VII. It just fleshed out the world so fully and so enjoyably. And now with the new trilogy, getting to see all of that come together in one package, released in 3 installments over the course of like 15 years. But I mean, it's magical. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a game that truly rewards your deep knowledge of the lore. It is full of characters and references from the other Final Fantasy VII media over the years. Rest assured, you don't need to know these characters or these references to enjoy the story, but man, they made me feel so good. So yeah, Rebirth is already starting with that strong advantage. Couple that with an already exciting and well-paced story to begin with, now fleshed out with even more detail and more in-depth character interactions, and I don't see how you can beat this. These characters that I loved as a kid, I actually got to experience them loving each other. Like, they're all friends. They have inside jokes with each other, they laugh, they pick on each other. Just their incidental dialogue as they make their way through the world is so endearing. It even made me a fan of the characters I didn't care for as much in the original. Hello Cid, nice to finally meet you. And Cait Sith, I wish I could still call you Ketshi, but alas, this is the world we live in. The game's story builds on not just the history of the game that came before it, i.e. Remake, but the entire series' legacy. It's a massive achievement in storytelling. It is truly the best experience I've had with a video game in at least a decade, maybe 2. It's that good. So where does that leave us? I think from the amount of gushing I've done about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you can tell that I have something of a preference. Given that the conceit of this whole undertaking is that I'm pitting 2 games against each other, then the crown clearly has to go to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But that is not me saying that Final Fantasy XVI is a bad game. In fact, it's a great game. I enjoyed the heck out of it. Some people, and specifically some reviewers, don't like to assign a number to their review for a lot of reasons. I kinda do, to be honest. When I was actually a game reviewer, I didn't get to assign a number. That was done by the editorial team. I think that's a fairly common practice for whatever reason. But now that I'm fully on my own, I'm gonna indulge myself a bit. Final Fantasy XVI, that's a solid 8 out of 10 game, guys. The combat is fun, the story is great, and honestly, it's just exciting to see a new team take a crack at building an all-new Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a 10 out of 10. There are only a very small number of games I would say that about. Chrono Trigger, Shadow of the Colossus. The vast majority of my list of favorite games would probably rank a 9, 9.5 at best. Rebirth is a 10. There's a bit of an investment required to get the most out of this game. You really should at least play Remake first. But that aside, I can recommend this wholeheartedly and without reservation. I love this game so much. Final Fantasy has been sort of stumbling around for the last 15 years, trying to find an identity. Let's make it this. If the series were to continue down the trail blazed by Rebirth, I think we'll be in for something really special. And that's that. What did you guys think about the dueling reviewing? Let me know down in the comments. And also tell me if you agree with how I rank these 2 titans of the JRPG world. I would ask that you please consider liking and subscribing. And if you want to support me on Patreon, that's an option too, but totally up to you. Thank you regardless for watching and commenting. It really means so much. Anyway, until next time.